Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Rebuttal podcast, where we break down case law, calamity, and of course, chaos in the legal field. I am once again your host, Reb Maisel, and today we are going to get right into it. But first, if you are a YouTube watcher, you may notice we are in a different location. Okay, different roomage going on. My little sister lived with me for a year, which was amazing. I couldn't have asked for anything better. I loved it. She moved out. She has moved on to bigger and better and probably quieter things. So now her former bedroom is now my office. Cute. So now I'm in here. Now we're recording in here. We are not indeed recording in my living room any longer. Amazing. We upgraded. God bless. Today's episode is going to be, how do I say this? Heavy. Content warning for today's episode for violence against children. Please take care of yourselves and others, but I do stand by the fact that this information is extremely important. I do not want to be and have never wanted to be the type of true crime podcast that capitalizes on suffering or just wants to be clickbait constantly. These issues that I'm going to touch on are extremely, extremely distressing, but they are experienced by people everywhere across this country and right now in jails and prisons in the United States. And if we don't highlight it, if we don't talk about it, then their stories are silenced. So if this means that people are educated about it, they are informed about it, they are able to advocate for reform and policy changes and the protection of our youth in pretrial detention, any adult even in pretrial detention, awaiting trial and not yet convicted of a crime, some never convicted of a crime, then I've done my job. With that being said, let's get into it. It is early morning on May 15th, 2010, in the Belmont section of the Bronx in New York City. Kalief Browder and his friend are on their way home from a party. He is 16. Walking home along Arthur Avenue, Little Italy's main street, they pass familiar stores, delis, and bakeries, their corrugated aluminum shutters pulled down and padlocked tight. Suddenly, a police car speeds toward them and careens to a stop. More police cars arrive in rapid succession. As they stare into the police headlights, an officer informs them that they are suspects in a robbery. Kalief maintains his innocence. I did not rob anyone, Kalief says. You can check my pockets. The officers searched Kalief and his friend but found nothing. As Kalief recalls, one of the officers then walked back to his squad car where the alleged victim was and returned with a new story. The man said that they had robbed him not that night anymore, but 2 weeks earlier. The police handcuffed the teens and pressed them into the back of a squad car. What am I being charged for? Browder asked. I didn't do anything. He remembers an officer telling them, we're just going to take you to the precinct. Most likely you can go home. Browder whispered to his friend, are you sure you didn't do anything? His friend insisted that he hadn't. At the 48th precinct, the pair were fingerprinted and locked in a holding cell. A few hours later, when an officer opened the door, Browder jumped up. I can leave now, he said. Instead, the teens were taken to central booking at the Bronx County Criminal Court. Late on Saturday, 17 hours after the police picked Browder up, an officer and a prosecutor interrogated him alone, and he again maintained his innocence. The next day, he was led into a courtroom where he learned he had been charged with robbery, grand larceny, and assault. The judge released his friend, permitting him to remain free while the case moved to the courts, but the judge ordered Browder to be held and set bail at $3,000. The amount was out of reach for his family, and soon Browder found himself aboard a Department of Correction bus. He fought back panic, he told someone later. Staring through the grating on the bus window, he watched the Bronx disappear. Soon there was water on either side as the bus made its way across a long, narrow bridge to Rikers Island. 16-year-old Kalief Browder would not be released from Rikers Island for 3 more years. He was never convicted of a crime. I repeat, he was never convicted of a crime. 3 years after his initial arrest and his bus ride to Rikers Island, the prosecutor's office dropped all charges against him. Browder steadfastly refused to plead guilty, insisting he was innocent. Browder stayed at Rikers for 3 years, and during those 3 years, he claims he endured constant beatings and violence and psychological damage at the hands of both inmates and guards. But Browder was never convicted of anything. There were no hearings in any court in which evidence was presented against him. There was only the uncorroborated allegation by a, quote, man in a squad car that Kalief and his friend had robbed him 2 weeks ago at the time of his arrest, and even that story was inconsistent with the police officer's original accusation. On this flimsy basis, Browder had been incarcerated and imprisoned, invisible to a system which hypocritically holds that justice delayed is justice denied. Justice, however, never showed up at all for Browder. Justice, like Browder, disappeared for 3 years. Browder spent 2 years of the 3 years he was incarcerated without trial in solitary confinement. He was forced to accept conditions of hyper-isolation, which were particularly inhumane for 2 years of his life. And he had to accept that this was happening without ever having a day in court, without ever having an opportunity to confront witnesses, without ever being treated as a citizen with rights. Browder said inmates washed their clothes with soap and a metal bucket, causing rust stains on their clothes. Browder's mother began visiting him weekly and provided him with clean clothes and snack money. To avoid becoming a target of the inmates, he slept on top of his belongings, including his bucket. Browder was a victim of carceral violence. On one occasion, he and other inmates were lined up against a wall. Correction officers wanted to find the instigator of a fight. Browder and the inmates were punched one by one. Browder said that his nose was leaking. Their faces were bloody, their eyes were swollen. The guards threatened the inmates with solitary confinement if they reported their injuries. On October 20th, 2010, when Browder had only recently turned 17, a gang member spat in Browder's face. Later in the day, Browder punched the gang leader and was set upon by 15 gang members. On September 23rd, 2012, a video was recorded showing Browder in handcuffs being assaulted by guards. After a fight with an inmate, Browder was put in solitary confinement for 2 weeks. He later said of the other inmate, quote, he was throwing shoes at people. I told him to stop. I actually took a sneaker and I threw it, and he got mad. He swung on me and we started fighting. Altogether, Browder spent nearly 2 years in solitary confinement, mostly after fights with inmates in which he was trying to defend himself. Browder later said that while in solitary confinement, correction officers beat him when he was showering. During his time in solitary confinement, Browder was allowed to participate in activities such as reading, and he also studied for the GED. Browder lost significant weight because the food delivered through a slot in the door was not enough for a growing adolescent. Unlike when he was held in the general population, Browder could not supplement his meals with snacks. Browder also was denied access to the classrooms and teachers offered at the facility. Instead, while studying for the GED exam, he had to slide his homework through the slot in the door, and sometimes the guards neglected to collect it. Browder, who was called foolish by other inmates for not taking a plea deal and instead choosing to fight for his innocence in the face of dubious charges, grew severely depressed and attempted to take his own life twice while incarcerated. His first attempt was in February of 2012, almost 2 years after he had first arrived at Rikers Island. He was now almost 19. I did not do it, Browder would say, for 3 years. In front of judge after judge, in front of prosecutors, I did not do it. After 3 years at Rikers Island, 2 of those in solitary confinement, on March 13th, 2013, Browder appeared before Bronx judge Patricia Domingo. She offered Browder a plea bargain of immediate release for his admission of guilt to 2 misdemeanors with consideration of time already served. Browder refused the offer and was returned to Rikers. On May 29, 2013, prosecutors revealed that the alleged witness against Browder had returned to Mexico and could not give his testimony against him. After trying and failing to contact him, they advised the judge that they were no longer in a position to go to trial and sought to dismiss the case. Domingo immediately ordered Browder's release. He walked out of Rikers the following day, and the charges were formally dropped a week later, 3 years after he was picked up. after walking home from a party in the Bronx. Soon after his release, Browder passed the GED examination and later enrolled at the Bronx Community College. He participated in the City University of New York's Future Now program, which offered a college education to previously incarcerated youths. Again, Browder was never convicted of a crime. Browder completed 11 credits and finished his semester with a grade point average of a 3.56. After his release, Browder and his brother Akeem sought legal representation. A family member found the Brooklyn civil rights attorney Paul V. Prestia. In November 2013, Browder filed a lawsuit against the New York City Police Department, the Bronx District Attorney, and the Department of Corrections. Prestia claimed that there had been a malicious prosecution and the court had been misled about the prosecution's readiness for trial. But Browder's experiences in solitary would follow him outside of Rikers. Browder suffered from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and very severe depression. Because of his depression, Browder did not attend college in the fall semester but re-enrolled in the spring. On May 11, 2015, Browder submitted a paper titled A Closer Look at Solitary Confinement in the United States, for which he received an A grade. He wrote, "Solitary confinement should be looked at as a whole around the U.S., and even though changes toward the solitary confinement system have begun in some states, more needs to be done and addressed around the country. In a lot of jails and prisons, there are a lot of living circumstances and practices that go on within that are not addressed that people need to shed light on, like solitary confinement, for example. Maybe another form of punishment on segregation should be implemented to deal with inmates who break jail rules, as opposed to inmates who cause severe harm to other inmates and correctional officers, because the mental health risk it poses are too great." End quote. Browder worked at the BCC as a tutor in mathematics for the GED. He wanted to work to support his mother. He worked for a while as a security guard, but was dismissed when his history of mental illness came to light. He also handed out flyers near Wall Street. Browder said, quote, "I see businessmen and businesswomen dressed in suits. I want to be successful like them." In November 2013, Browder made a second suicide attempt and was admitted to the psychiatric ward of St. Barnabas Hospital, the first of 3 admissions to the ward. On June 6, 2015, at 12:15 p.m., Browder took his own life at his mother's home. His mother would discover his body. He was 22 years old. On June 11, 2015, mourners mounted a 3-hour vigil near Manhattan Detention Center and chanted "Justice for Kalief." A concurrent visual was held on Rikers Island. People held up signs reading "Black Lives Matter." Browder was interred in an unidentified Bronx cemetery following his funeral service on June 16, 2015. Kalief Browder's story gained national attention, even when he was initially just released, but even more so after his death, and public sentiment was weighed heavily in favor of reform, of doing something, of justice for Kalief Browder, because although his death was ruled a suicide, it was not. It was a homicide at the hands of the prosecutor's office, the correction officers, the police officer who arrested him that night in 2010, and Rikers Island. Kalief Browder's mother said, quote, "He may have hung himself, but the strings were pulled by the system." This is a reality that Kalief Browder's mother lived with every day, that her son didn't take his own life so much as submit to a weight he carried with him out of that hole. The imagery sticks. Kalief's body, the cord around his neck, its other end disappearing somewhere in the depths of Rikers Island. After his death, Browder's estate continued his legal action against the city. It would not be until January 2019, almost 4 years after Kalief Browder's death, that the city of New York would settle a civil lawsuit with the Browder family for $3.3 million. Nobody from the Bronx DA's office was ever held personally accountable for keeping Browder incarcerated for 3 years without a trial or a conviction. Kalief Browder's death, wrought by the icy steel hands of New York's criminal justice system, precipitated the state's newfound effort to reform its racially and economically discriminatory bail system, of course, at the urging of the public. In April 2019, New York State enacted sweeping reforms to its criminal justice system set to take effect on January 1st, 2020. Among the goals of these reforms, the state intended to diminish economic inequality in its bail and pretrial detention systems. Before turning even 3 months old, these reforms reduced the pretrial prison population in New York City by 40%. As of March 5th, 2020, about 3,000 people were in New York City prisons awaiting trial, down from nearly 5,000 people at the time of the reform's enactment. Progress notwithstanding, just months after the new bail law had taken effect, the legislature enacted a series of amendments restoring the bail law somewhat closer to its original state before the April 2019 reforms. Despite the fact that New York's bail reforms reduced city and state prison populations, the revised bail law still fails and falls flat in its attempt to resolve the economic inequality in the state's pretrial detention system, which was an overarching purpose of these reforms. New York City jails, in particular Rikers Island, have always been notorious for violence for adults and children alike. Although gang-related conflict in jail is prevalent, brutality carried out by corrections officers in pretrial detention city jails that are holding people who are innocent and not yet proven guilty, is also an intrinsic part of this violence. Corrections officers have dragged an inmate by the neck, handcuffed and punched the inmate in the face in a gang of 3, kicked and punched a man in the stomach, beaten inmates after forcing them to strip naked, forced inmates to eat cigarettes and flush their head in toilets, kept a man in a cell with no running water for 2 days, and then hit him in the face when he asked for water, and pepper sprayed someone as he lay face down in the shower after another officer hit him in the back of the head so hard he lost consciousness. Formerly incarcerated people have also spoken about the horrors they experienced in these jails beyond this brutality, which include no access to cold water or cold showers on scorching hot summer days, mice and cockroach infestations in cells, and a lack of access to necessary and life-saving medication. Since facilities were first built on Rikers Island, the Department of Corrections actions have prompted lawsuits that allege organizational indifference to these problems and overwhelming mismanagement. The injustice of something like this happening to anyone seems unbelievable. Fantastic. However, of the more than 740,000 people held in locally run jails in pretrial detention in the United States, 2/3 of them have not been convicted of a crime. I repeat, 67% of those people have not been convicted of a crime. As despite our justice system being based on the principle that people who are of different backgrounds should be treated equally, after an arrest, wrongful or not, a person's ability to leave jail, pre-trial detention, innocent and not yet proven guilty, and return home to fight the charges typically depends on that person's access to money. That's because in virtually all jurisdictions in this country, people are required to pay cash bail in order to secure their freedom. Originally, bail was designed to ensure people returned to court to face charges against them. Now we know that simple solutions like court reminders often can achieve that purpose. The money bail system has morphed into one that perpetuates widespread wealth-based incarceration. Today, pretrial incarceration caused by unaffordable bail is the single greatest driver of convictions and is responsible for the ballooning of our nation's jail and prison populations. In America, out of the 780,000 people who are held in pretrial detention right now today, 2/3 of them have never been convicted of a crime. In 2018, over 195,000 presumptively innocent youth, minors, were detained between arrest and final disposition of their juvenile delinquency case. Troublingly, the procedures designed to ensure objectivity and fairness in pretrial detention decision-making instead invite subjective judgments and result in disproportionate pretrial detentions of youth of color, just like Kalief Browder. A Human Rights Watch report found that, quote, youth offenders often spend significant amounts of their time in U.S. prisons isolated from the general prison population. Juveniles can be placed in solitary confinement for a multitude of reasons, ranging from violence against guards to having, quote, unauthorized amounts of clothing or art supplies. The Department of Justice found that 47% of juvenile detention centers used solitary confinement, And some held juveniles for up to 23 hours a day with no human interaction. Mind you, the Supreme Court has refused to hold that the Constitution guarantees inmates, the accused, who are held in our jails and prisons, the right to counsel an attorney in disciplinary proceedings that go on in jails and prisons. So these disciplinary proceedings, these punishments that are handed out by who? In 2014, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York released a report on their investigation into the patterns and practices of treatment of adolescent inmates on Rikers Island, finding systemic defects that result in the pervasive violation of the adolescent inmates' constitutional rights. Mind you, this report came out after Kalief's story prior to his death hit the newsstands, okay? It gained national attention. A documentary was filmed. He spoke to everyone about his experience, and there was, of course, public outrage and therefore pressure. And so the U.S. Attorney's Office said, fine, we'll investigate. And sure enough, they found 95% of the adolescent population on Rikers Island is Black or Latino. New York is uniquely harsh with its treatment of 16 and 17-year-olds, as it and North Carolina are the only states to set the minimum age of criminal responsibility at 16. Over 75% of youth on Rikers Island are awaiting trial and have not been convicted of a crime. Let me repeat that, and I know I've emphasized it already, but let that not sink in too much where you get used to it. Over 75% of youth on Rikers Island are awaiting trial and have not been convicted of a crime. Mind you, around the United States, 780,000 people, of those, 66% have not been convicted of a crime. The prevalence of the unconstitutional conduct on Rikers Island is attributable in large part to the lack of accountability among Department of Corrections (DOC) staff members on Rikers Island, which results in a code of silence. To effectively deal with the pervasive pattern and practice of conduct on the part of DOC staff that violates adolescent inmates on Rikers Island's constitutional rights, it is crucial to understand the differences between adolescents and the adults and the power of the DOC staff union. Because, of course, they have protections. And there are thousands of stories and examples of these youths' mistreatment. While resting his head on a desk during class, Inmate H abruptly woke up to a correctional officer who was hitting him in his ribcage. While not ideal, sleeping in class is expected behavior for a 16 to 17-year-old adolescent boy like Inmate H. Yet this behavior, along with other quite normal adolescent behavior, is often met with excessive force in adolescent jails on Rikers Island. After jumping up to defend himself, an officer punched Inmate H in the eye hard enough that he fell to the floor. 3 or 4 more officers joined. Adult officers. Adult grown men joined in, kicking the adolescent Inmate H in his back, head, face, and mouth while pepper spraying him an inch from his eye. The teacher in the classroom, the adult grown teacher in the classroom, saw Inmate H lying on the floor looking dazed and encouraged the class to look away. She heard an officer shouting at Inmate H, loud thuds, and Inmate H crying for his mother. Not until 4 hours after the incident did anyone take Inmate H to see medical staff. This incident occurred in September of 2012. I cannot stress enough that my opinions and thoughts on policing in this country and correction officers in this country and the Department of Corrections as a whole and the prison system is drawn from real stories. I don't give a fuck if your feelings are hurt because your family member is a da-da-da and he's one of the good guys. I don't give a shit, okay? Because for every good guy, there were 15 instances where he stood and watched, where he did what everyone else did, where he shut his mouth, where the code of fucking silence was held higher and more important than a child's rights, than a person's rights. And it doesn't fucking matter. I'm sorry. It doesn't matter that anyone in the prison system, these inmates, whether they're in jail or prison, have been convicted of a crime. That, I think, also needs to be underscored because, yes, it's batshit insane that people are being quite literally held in these conditions for years and years with they're innocent people, okay? Innocent, not proven guilty per our democratic system, okay? Yes, it's heinous that happens, but why does larceny, stealing a backpack, stealing an iPod, getting in a fight at school, assault, whatever, why does that suddenly mean that every single person you encounter after that happens, after you're convicted or after you plead out, whatever, is allowed to beat the fuck out of you? And you deserved it. And you don't deserve basic human rights. Just basic treatment like you're a person and not an animal. That's why, I mean, the amount of people in our country who have criminal backgrounds, criminal histories that are still good people. You can be a good person and fuck up. The amount of people in this country who've broken the law and just haven't been caught and just weren't picked up on the side of the goddamn road, just weren't a black youth in a neighborhood that was overly patrolled by police who waited around for anyone to mess up. The line between you or your child and these children or another person is thinner than you think. And so, yes, I am going to stand 10 toes down on my opinions on the absolute desperate need in this country for reform of our prison systems, of our pretrial detention system, which we're hitting on here for juveniles, but also adults alike, okay? Policing, corrections, all of that. It doesn't matter to me that there might be good people who it doesn't matter if you're offended, because I would rather offend every single person who has a quote unquote family member who's a good person or a good cop or a good correction officer or whatever. I would rather offend every single fucking one of you, but have one more child taken out of this fucking system because of it. So I don't care about tiptoeing, because nobody tiptoed around these children's rights and feelings and emotions and needs. You barreled right through them. The teacher who watched, the corrections officers who jumped in, 4 grown men, you fucking pathetic pieces of shit deserve to burn in hell. To gang up on someone, on a child, or on just anyone who is outnumbered and physically weaker than you, it'll be a cold day in hell before I ever feel a shred of sympathy for anything that comes your way because of karma, because it will come your way. If it isn't because you get fired or because you're disciplined, because Lord knows that never happens, as we'll see, then it'll come in other ways. Inmate H's incident occurred in September of 2012, and it is one of 200 samples, simply samples, of use of force incidents included in a report released on August 4th, 2014. The report was the product of an investigation by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York into the patterns and practices of treatment of adolescent inmates on Rikers Island. The 200 samples illustrate the systemic defects that result in the violation of the adolescent inmates' constitutional rights. The report concluded that DOC staff members not only insufficiently investigate and report use of force incidents, but also frequently falsify reports. Pretends to be shocked. The rare times DOC staff members are found to have used force inappropriately, they are nonetheless insufficiently disciplined. While the incident with Inmate H is representative of the common vicious practices that occur daily on Rikers Island, it is unique in that there were multiple witnesses corroborating Inmate H's version of events, most notably statements from 3 teachers. Inmates, medical staff members, and teachers rarely report use of force incidents out of fear of retribution from guards. Greatest country in the world. People chat about, well, imagine getting arrested, thrown in prison in another country. We are every other country's worst fucking nightmare. We're on a list of top 10, baby. Are you fucking kidding me? We've been on human rights watch lists for decades. For this, our incarceration population is the highest in the world, and it's not because we commit more crime. It's because we give unfettered power to the people who put others there. We do have rights, and the only fucking people who have a prayer of keeping our rights intact are defense attorneys and public defenders who are the ones literally fighting tooth and nail for any of these inmates to get fucking justice. Additionally, it is particularly common for excessive use of force incidents to occur in areas where there are no surveillance cameras, just as was the case with Inmate H, making it difficult to hold DOC staff members accountable. My God. The lack of accountability on Rikers Island persists because DOC officers maintained much political clout as members of the largest municipal jail union in the country, the Correction Officers Benevolent Association. Moreover, they are led by a powerful president. A recent surge in the prison population over the past decades, the quote, war on drugs, over-policing in minority communities, racial profiling, and judicial discretion leading to disproportionately harsh sentences for people of color have largely resulted in a majority-minority prison population. Black males are most significantly affected as they are 2.5 times more likely to be detained than Latino males and 6 times more likely to be detained than white males. In 2010, 2/3 of the 816 and 17-year-olds incarcerated in New York were Black, 26% were Latino, and 5% were white. The Rikers youth population comes from disenfranchised, marginalized, low-income communities of color that lack political power and resources, making it easy for politicians and officials to ignore the abuses they experience. Rikers Island's history is wrought with these types of issues. The history of Rikers Island begins in 1884 when New York City bought Rikers Island from the Riker family with plans to expand its size and build a prison facility to relieve the overcrowding and squalid conditions present in the city's 2 operating jails. Opened in the 1930s, the Rikers Island Penitentiary was accessible only by ferry, and the people incarcerated there lived next to garbage dumped by the Department of Sanitation, despite the city's intention for it to be on the cutting edge of penitentiary design. By 1939, a Bronx court deemed it to be, quote, nearly unlivable. Regardless, the city's use of Rikers kept growing, leaving out the garbage piles and building new facilities in the 1960s and 70s. In 1974, in response to a class action suit brought by the Legal Aid Society, a court ordered the temporary shutdown of a jail near City Hall in Manhattan, known colloquially as, quote, the Tombs, for its poor living conditions. After this, the DOC started to house increasingly more detainees, particularly pretrial detainees, on Rikers Island. An increased reliance on policing in the 1980s meant that Rikers Island housed an ever-ballooning population of detainees. Under Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, who was recently disbarred, yep, bye, you're not a lawyer anymore, for so many more reasons than one, the Rikers population skyrocketed in the early 1990s. For example, in 1991, around 22,000 people were held in DOC custody. To handle the overflow, DOC set up tents and Navy barges to house people, one of which, nicknamed the Boat, still operates today. Although the New York City jail population reached its peak around 30 years ago and crime rates have steadily fallen since then, city jail facilities, problematic conditions, prevalence of violence, and correction staff's persistent corruption have never truly gone away. After years of activism concentrated into the hashtag CloseRikers campaign, however, in conjunction with the momentum built by allegations of pervasive brutality in the lawsuit Nunes versus the City of New York, which was joined by the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Mayor Bill de Blasio announced that his administration would officially close Rikers Island. This announcement was made in 2017, mind you. If you're curious and you're going to do a quick Google search of Rikers Island, you will find that it is very much open, and you will find 20 new news articles in the last fucking week about inmates alleging that they were injured, were denied access to medical care, or that people died. There's a whole paragraph about, what the plan was. I don't even want to get into it because it's just going to piss me the fuck off, okay? Because, that didn't happen. Okay, it didn't happen. Basically, they had this whole plan and then COVID hit and they said, wow, we really need to house some people. So it's still open. And yes, it's still terrible. People who are awaiting trial, who are innocent until proven guilty, are being held in conditions that are deplorable in many jails across this country simply because they cannot make cash bail. One of the most famous of them is Rikers Island, which, because of the depravity that goes on there, legal activists, mostly headed by public defenders, the defense attorneys who have to represent these people and watch this go on and try to fight for them to have rights, for them to get out, and for them to have a semblance of justice, they started tracking the number of fucking people who died per year in custody, in pretrial detention, in the custody of the government of the state. And all of this, what I'm describing, very much sounds like the description of a fascist government having political prisoners. Does it fucking not? Sorry, not to get extreme here, but that's what we're looking at. The United States has been on the human rights watch for decades over its incarceration system, over its incarceration population, okay? This isn't news for anyone else in the world, but for some reason it seems to be news for people in this country who don't have the resources to know about it or don't open their eyes. And what's worse is that the number of deaths that are tracked by these people who are following what goes on at Rikers Island and other pretrial detention centers around this country, at Rikers Island specifically, they know for a fact that the number that comes out of the Department of Corrections, the DOC, is inaccurate, is a much lower number than the reality. A report from the summer of 2023 found evidence that the DOC has only reported to the public or press 68 of the at least 120 deaths that have occurred on its watch since 2014. The steady stream of deaths underlines the city's failure to provide basic safety, medical care, and support in its jails, and also the fact that so many pretrial detainees are victims of alleged suicides. In 2019, 19 people died in custody at Rikers Island. 19 in 1 year in pretrial detention. That number is staggering. Pretrial detention has profound costs. In fiscal terms, the total annual cost of pretrial jail beds is estimated to be $14 billion with a B dollars, or 17% of total spending on corrections. At the individual level, pretrial detention can result in the loss of employment, housing, or child custody in addition to the loss of freedom. Pretrial detention also affects case outcomes. No fewer than 5 empirical studies published in the last year deploying quasi-experimental design have shown that pretrial detention causally increases a defendant's chance of conviction, makes it more likely they're going to be convicted, which is asinine, as well as the likely sentence length, which is, again, asinine. The increase in convictions is primarily an increase in guilty pleas among defendants who otherwise would have had their charges dropped because they just want to get the fuck out of pretrial detention and they do not have the funds or resources to post bail, which is so insane that we allow in this country. Land of the free. The plea-inducing effect of pretrial detention undermines the legitimacy of the criminal justice system itself, especially if some, if not most, of those convicted are innocent. Yes, the conditions at Rikers Island stick out in someone's mind when they look up bail reform and they look up pretrial detention horror stories. However, these types of situations and these conditions are absolutely not exclusive, not special to Rikers Island only, New York only, at all. Jails across this country, in big cities across this country, are wrought with the same issues, with the same conditions, with the same violations of constitutional rights and brutality that pretrial detainees, juveniles, and adults alike are exposed to without merit, without cause, and without ever getting a trial. Because of this, the source of the problem, as opposed to just the conditions of the jails, right, has become the focus for many reformers, for many activists. Bail reform. The need to reform America's cash bail system is not new. It's not even this millennia new. Cash bail reform has been enacted several times. There have been several waves of this in U.S. history, okay? Because these problems keep coming up and people, the numbers that you see of people in pretrial detention without a trial is too much to stomach. And sometimes our country is fed the fuck up. Okay. 70s, I think it was like 70s and then again in the 90s and again, now it's happened several times. Okay. This new wave of bail reform stems from a very pressing need to do something about the number of people who are subject to these jails, to these conditions, and to incarceration at all when they are innocent until proven guilty. They're supposed to be, okay? And yes, I could do an entire rest of this episode on just the need to reform the conditions in these jails specifically. I am going to dedicate an entire episode simply to prisons, okay? And tie that into the need and for reform there and how reforms are being enacted and put in place to make things better, okay? But going from a no pillow to a memory foam pillow isn't going to attack in this episode the ultimate issue: pretrial detention, cash bail. Despite its historical reputation for individual liberty, the United States is the incarceration capital of the world. With fewer than 5% of the world's population, the United States holds 25% of its prisoners. The cause for this high percentage appears to be a combination of policy, policing, and related cultural trends. While endless suggestions exist for reducing the prison population, making the criminal justice system run more effectively, and cutting the costs that accompany incarceration, an ideal starting point for reform is cash bail, a system that overwhelmingly controls persons entangled in the criminal justice system, and most importantly, persons who have never been to trial, who have never been convicted of a crime. Thousands of defendants appear daily in U.S. courts to have pretrial release conditions set for them. Defendants must satisfy these conditions to ensure their appearance for subsequent court dates. One important condition is paying a cash bond in return for pretrial release. The amount imposed is based on the seriousness of the crime, the defendant's criminal history, and other factors related to appearance in court. However, calculation of the amount imposed almost always lacks any inquiry into the defendant's ability to pay. As a result, many remain incarcerated for extensive periods of time, years, awaiting trial. They are detained not because they are dangerous or unlikely to appear, but simply because they lack the funds to satisfy the bail amount set for them. I repeat, the millisecond bail reform gets brought up, okay? Everyone without a degree and without a Google active search going on pulls out of their reading comprehension brain they're still using from 5th grade. They think, oh, cause and effect. People who can't post bail, it's because the bail's high, because they're trying to keep those dangerous people off the streets. Okay? There's a reason why we're trying to keep people off, whatever. Kings and queens. You need to listen before you speak. Listen before you speak. They are not detained because they are dangerous or a flight risk. Actually, there have been thousands of studies done, surveys done on the reality that the cash bail system in its infancy, in trying to get people to come back, for their court dates, that's the whole fucking point of it, whatever, all right? It doesn't even really help with the whole court appearance situation, all right? All it ends up doing is force people who would have shown up to their court dates regardless if they would have been allowed to go outside of these walls, okay, while they are innocent. Yeah, it forces them to remain behind bars. Opponents of bail reform argue that the cash bail system currently in place is, quote, necessary and justified in order to maintain community safety. But regardless of the arguments put forth against bail reform, it is a fact and a truth and a reality that the continued existence of cash bail as a tool to subjugate the most vulnerable is among the most pressing civil rights issues today. Cash bail morphs criminal convictions from an adjudication of factual and legal guilt to an inquiry into wealth status. It creates an income-based system of differential justice by detaining the poor and freeing the rich. Mind you, there are ways to protect the public when violent potential repeat offenders are put up in court, okay, after their arrest, after their charge, and bail is discussed, that do not involve a cash bail system that is going to lock up the violent, potentially repeat offender person for the benefit of the public, to make sure that the public is safe or that their victims are safe if they survived, right? I'm thinking domestic violence situations for sure, okay, when those men are put out on bail and then the women are attacked and killed. Yeah. Those situations. But if what's putting them behind bars, keeping them behind bars, is simply making the amount of bail an astronomical amount that they know that they can't pay, but then throwing a $10,000 bail amount at someone that absolutely cannot pay it, even though it's a misdemeanor, okay, and they're now in a cell next to big violent, there's an issue here, right? There's a fucking issue here. On September 18th, 2022, 42-year-old Shannon Brandt hit and killed 18-year-old Kaylor Ellingson with his SUV following a heated altercation in McHenry, North Dakota. Brandt admitted to the crime and was, quote, charged with vehicular homicide and leaving the scene of an accident that resulted in death. Despite court documents revealing Brandt's past DUI history, unlawful possession of alcohol, and fleeing a police officer on foot, 2 days later, on September 20th, 2022, Brandt was released from custody after posting $50,000 bail. On September 12th, 2022, just 6 days prior to when Shannon Brandt posted his bail, 42-year-old Ivan Chung was charged with aggravated rape 4 counts, aggravated rape of a child 4 counts, and aggravated statutory rape 2 counts in Boston, Massachusetts. 16 days later, on September 28th, 2022, Chung walked out of Boston Municipal Court after posting a $200,000 bail. In contrast, in March of 2016, 31-year-old Jessica Preston was arrested for driving with a suspended license in Macomb County, Michigan. Despite being 8 months pregnant, the judge gave her the choice of going to jail until she received a hearing date or come up with $10,000 for bail. Preston did not have the financial resources to make bail and as a result was put in jail. 5 days later, Preston went into labor. When the jail staff refused to call an ambulance, Preston had no choice but to give birth on a mat lying on the jailhouse floor. These 3 stories reveal that despite the wide range of crimes that were committed, the determining factors to secure the pretrial release of a murderer, a rapist, and a traffic violator was money. While Shannon Brandt and Ivan Chung were charged with violent crimes, they were both released because they had the means to pay their bail. In contrast, Jessica Preston, who was arrested for a non-violent crime, remained in pretrial detention because she could not afford to pay her way out. The rule is not that everyone is an unsafe, violent, danger to the community criminal. In the Supreme Court case of United States versus Salerno in 1987, the Supreme Court stated unequivocally, quote, "In our society, liberty is the norm, and detention prior to trial or without trial is the carefully limited exception." End quote. The 8th Amendment to the United States Constitution provides that, quote, "excessive bail shall not be required," but its text is silent on whether there exists an absolute right to the opportunity to post bail. After the 1984 Federal Bail Reform Act explicitly permitted preventive detention, the Salerno court reiterated that the 8th Amendment's bail clause does not convey an absolute right to bail. In upholding the 1984 Federal Bail Reform Act as facially valid, the Salerno court held that the reach of the 8th Amendment's bail clause goes only so far as to prohibit the imposition of bail that is, quote, "excessive given the circumstances." In short, a criminal defendant does not have the absolute right to the opportunity to post bail. It is constitutional for the federal government to incarcerate an individual pre-trial without giving them the chance to meet financial conditions of release. And the vast majority of inmates on Rikers Island and those in pretrial detention around the country are charged with low-level offenses, okay? The majority. So what is the cash bail system? What is this system we need to reform so bad? Well, let's talk about what exactly that reform. So what is bail reform and what is the cash bail system? I will explain it to you so you can make your own educated judgment. People who use the phrase bail reform most often refer to changes to the criminal legal system to reduce unnecessary pretrial detention. Bail reform typically focuses on financial conditions of pretrial release, often called money bond or cash bail, because they result in detention based on a person's wealth or access to money. We use the phrase pretrial advancement or pretrial improvement rather than bail reform because improving pretrial systems requires more than a single fix, like eliminating monetary bonds. Sustained and measurable improvement requires a comprehensive approach to the pretrial system as a whole, from the first point of contact with law enforcement through case disposition. So, what is bail? Bail is not just the money, though people most often equate money with it because of how pervasive our cash bail system is. Bail, the word bail actually isn't associated with the money aspect, okay? Bail is the process of releasing people who have been arrested and charged with crimes. The U.S. Supreme Court is unequivocal that during the pretrial phase, release before trial must be the norm and detention the carefully limited exception. The presumption of innocence and the right to physical liberty is foundational in the U.S. Constitution. Courts can, however, require people to meet conditions of release, quote unquote. Judges may impose conditions to provide reasonable assurance that a person returns to court and remains law-abiding. Financial conditions of pretrial release are just one of many options. Other common conditions include pretrial supervision, location monitoring, and no contact orders. Monetary bonds are so commonly used in the United States that they have wrongly become synonymous with the term bail. So, what is a money bond? A money bond is an amount of money a person must pay to get out of jail. If you can't afford to pay, you stay in jail. If you can pay, even if you are a serious risk to your community and community safety, just like those two examples I provided to you earlier about the rapist and the murderer, you are released from jail. Yay, you had the money, good job. Multiple studies have concluded that any amount of money does not improve court attendance or law-abiding behavior. I repeat, multiple studies have concluded that any amount of money does not improve court attendance or law-abiding behavior. Just because you have the resources doesn't mean you're not going to go hit someone with your car again, drink and drive again, or sexually assault a child again, like that other person was charged with doing, okay? Money is used for two purposes: as a condition of release intended to encourage court appearance and arrest-free behavior, and to detain someone by setting an unaffordable bond amount. Money doesn't achieve either of those goals, however, reliably or safely. Instead of using money as a condition of release, systems can use supportive pretrial services. These services and other non-financial conditions can help people be successful, attend their hearings, and remain out of trouble. Systems that replace money as a detention mechanism create a clear and transparent process for preventive detention. This creates a legal framework for judges to make an informed and intentional decision about whether a person remains in jail or is released before trial. Because again, you can be held in pretrial detention without bail, without bond, right? Bail is not an option, right? There are no pretrial services or preventative measures that we can put in place that would make us feel safe about you being out there. Pretrial justice is a system in which decision-making honors and operates consistently with the presumption of innocence and liberty while enhancing community well-being and safety. People are treated with dignity and respect. Pretrial systems generate equitable outcomes for everyone, not just those who are wealthy or those who are white. And Black, Latino, Indigenous, and other people of color are not disproportionately arrested, booked, subjected to higher financial release conditions, or detained. Wouldn't that be great if we could have that realized in our country someday? In an effort to make pretrial justice a reality, the Bail Reform Act was passed by Congress in 1966 and revised in 1984 to clarify language and limitations on decisions about pretrial detention, release, and conditions of release and other related activities in the pretrial phase. This act applies only to the federal system, however, and doesn't impact most local pretrial decisions that are in states and counties. However, states and counties are using ideas from the federal system in their pretrial advancement efforts. Where exactly is this bail reform happening? Well, Illinois, New Jersey, New Mexico, and New York have indeed made significant changes to their pretrial systems within the last decade. But again, those are only 4 states. Across the country, money bail is set at levels that are far too high for many people or their families to pay. Defendants face an impossible choice: remain locked up in jail as the case moves through the system, pay a non-refundable fee to a for-profit bail bonds company, or plead guilty and give up the right to defend themselves at trial. And mind you, the ACLU has won at least one of its lawsuits against one of these for-profit bail bond companies to essentially aim to disband them, because it's fucked, right? The fact that this is a for-profit system is also not aligning with the lands of the free. For-profit bail bond companies and the insurance companies who back them don't want to see changes to a system that generates revenue for them. And so they lobby. Illinois recently became the first state to completely abolish cash bail and invest in alternatives to promote pretrial release and success. And mind you, this doesn't mean that the no bail, you're being held in pretrial detention because what you're accused of, right, is so heinous. That's not off the table. So people always scream and shout and yell about community safety, but studies have been done in these places, in these counties, in these areas that have implemented massive reforms to cash bail, even to the extent that they, removed it. And all of these studies show that there has not been an increase of crime due to people getting out, pre-trial. And it also establishes that there is not a higher rate of people refusing to show up for their court appearances, or, you know what I mean? Like, the whole idea of what pretrial detention was, or cash bail was supposed to deter, was people not showing up. And in all of the places where reforms have actually been implemented for enough of a period where they could actually get numbers and study it and get surveys that show us some empirical information, it very much shows that it is not a risk to community safety in some detrimental way by basically standing 10 toes down on these reforms, okay? It is a positive overall to get innocent people, innocent until proven guilty, out of jail pre-trial. At the very least, limit the amount of upwards of 700,000 people sitting in jail who have not, 60% of them have not been convicted of a crime, limiting the number of people who are sitting there. The bail reform movement also saw a massive victory in February 2020 when, following a pressure campaign, private equity firm Endeavor Capital divested from Aladdin Bail Bonds, the then largest for-profit bail bond company in the US. This came after a multi-year campaign by ACLU Smart Justice and Color of Change, pushing them and their investors to divest. The ACLU's next corporate target, according to their website, is Fairfax Financial, a Toronto-based company which has now assumed the title of the largest owner of commercial bail in the US, which is crazy that it's fucking based in Toronto. You're not even from here. God. My rebuttal for today's episode is not so much a summary, but a posing of more information to you. In-custody deaths are more likely to occur during pretrial detention, not after conviction. The leading cause of death in custody is suicide. About 77% of all people who died by suicide in jail have not been convicted of a crime. Other common causes include illness, drug overdoses, and violence. Regardless of how you feel about cash bail reform, maybe before or after this episode, about pretrial detention in general, about being tough on crime, we cannot ignore the facts, and we cannot ignore the tragedy and horror of stories like Kalief Browder's. He is only one in a very deep, very large bucket of thousands upon thousands of children and youth who have been detained and thrown into a system for years simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. This does not discredit the amount of adult victims there are, but as a voter, as a citizen, there are so many issues that you have a responsibility to be informed about if you're going to have an opinion about them, right? If you're going to vote about them. And I'm not asking you to be educated and informed on every single issue possible. That would be impossible. But what I'm asking you to do is to do research on the propositions that are on the ballot on the ticket this year, because there are bail reform initiatives that are going to be on the ballot somewhere. And each new county and state that pushes for that, if you are one of those people who can pay a little bit more attention and to support the people and to support the initiatives that make reform a reality in your county, in your state, in your locality, stories like Kalief Browder's will not be as prevalent. Stories like Inmate H will not be as prevalent, but it starts with you. Thank you for watching today's episode or listening to today's episode. I appreciate you for being here. I know it was a heavy one. I know that there are so many other things I could have said about pretrial detention. I know I could talk about this for hours and hours and hours, but I hope that this was enough to get your blood pumping, do some research, googly doogly, okay? Thank you for supporting Rebuttal Pod. I love you. This is my joy to do, and I appreciate that you guys love it. Subscribe on YouTube, follow on Instagram, and look out for more. Hug your loved ones and know and remember that the line between you and someone else who experiences the things that I talk about is thinner than you think. Love you. Be safe.